The blood trickled down Fiona Taylor's cheek as she urged her exhausted horse forward through the punishing New Mexico rain. Every hoofbeat put precious distance between her and the nightmare. She'd fled a marriage that had become her prison, a husband whose fists spoke louder than his vows. The year was 1875, and in this vast, unforgiving territory, a woman alone had few allies and fewer choices. She had ridden through the night, her body aching, the stolen horse beginning to falter beneath her. The rain had soaked through her thin cotton dress hours ago, plastering it against her skin, but the chill in her bones came from something deeper than the weather. Somewhere behind her, Randall would be awakening to find her gone, along with what little money she had managed to hide away over 3 years of torment. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the rolling landscape ahead. In that brief electric moment, Fiona spotted a cabin nestled against the foothills, a faint light glowing from within. Her heart lurched with both hope and terror. A stranger's door could mean salvation or danger worse than what she'd left behind. The horse stumbled, nearly sending her to the ground. "Just a little further," she whispered into its ear, though her own strength was failing just as quickly. When she reached the small homestead, Fiona could barely remain upright in the saddle. The modest cabin sat beside a barn and corral, with a small vegetable garden struggling against the wild landscape. She slid from the horse, her legs buckling as she hit the ground. Using the last of her strength, Fiona dragged herself to the door and knocked, each rap of her knuckles growing weaker than the last. The door swung open, revealing a tall man silhouetted by the warm light behind him. She tried to speak, to explain, to beg for help, but darkness clouded her vision, and Fiona felt herself falling forward into strong, unfamiliar arms. "Lord Almighty," were the last words she heard before consciousness slipped away entirely. Jake Young had been up since before dawn, listening to the rain hammer his roof while nursing a cup of coffee and whittling away at a piece of pine. Ranching in this territory was lonely work, and the small habits he'd developed helped pass the endless hours of solitude that stretched between infrequent trips to town. At 31, Jake had long ago accepted that his life would likely remain this way, just him, his cattle, and the unforgiving land he'd claimed 5 years earlier after returning from the war with memories he'd rather forget. The isolation suited him. Townsfolk asked too many questions about the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, about why he'd never taken a wife, about the nightmares that sometimes had him waking up shouting in the dark. When he heard the knock, Jake's first instinct was to reach for his Winchester. Visitors didn't come calling in weather like this unless they meant trouble or were in it. He approached the door cautiously, rifle in hand, and pulled it open. The sight that greeted him nearly stopped his heart. A woman, soaked to the bone and covered in bruises, swayed before him. One eye was swollen nearly shut, her lips split and bleeding. Before he could say more than an exclamation, she collapsed forward. Jake dropped his rifle against the door frame to catch her, her slight weight falling against his chest. "Hello," he called into the darkness, scanning the yard for whoever might have accompanied her, but there was only a half-dead horse, head hanging low in the rain. With practiced care, Jake lifted the unconscious woman and carried her inside, kicking the door closed behind him. He laid her gently on his bed, the only one in the small cabin, and quickly stoked the fire to bring more warmth to the room. The woman was shivering violently, her skin cold and pale beneath the bruises. Jake had seen enough injuries during the war to recognize the work of human hands rather than accident. Someone had beaten this woman, and recently. His jaw tightened as he gathered clean cloths and a basin of water to tend to her wounds. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked softly, but she remained unconscious. Jake hesitated, faced with the uncomfortable reality of her soaked clothes. Propriety demanded he leave her be, but experience told him that wet garments in her condition could lead to fever or worse. Moving as respectfully as possible, he removed only her outer dress and covered her immediately with several blankets, hanging the sodden garment by the fire to dry. As he cleaned the cut on her cheek, Jake studied her face. Despite the bruising, he could see she was young, perhaps mid-20s, with delicate features and auburn hair that would probably shine like copper when dry and clean. Who was she running from? And more importantly, would they come looking? He glanced toward his rifle by the door. It had been years since he'd had to use it against anything but game, but the weight of it in his hands was a memory his body hadn't forgotten. "You're safe here," he said quietly, though she couldn't hear him. "I promise you that." Fiona dreamed of fire and fists, of Randall's face contorted in rage as he discovered her missing. In her nightmare, he was already on her trail, the hoofbeats of his horse thundering closer with each passing moment. She woke with a gasp, bolting upright in an unfamiliar bed. Pain lanced through her ribs, forcing a whimper from her lips as she took in her surroundings. A small, neat cabin, a fire crackling in the hearth, and watching her cautiously from a chair nearby, a man with the most piercing blue eyes she'd ever seen. "Easy now," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "You've got some bad bruising." Fiona clutched the blankets to her chest, suddenly aware she was wearing only her thin shift. "My dress drying by the fire," he explained, nodding toward the hearth where her garment hung. "It was soaked through. I didn't want you catching your death." She should have been frightened, alone in a strange man's cabin without her proper clothes. But something in his expression, a careful distance, a respectful concern, calmed her racing heart. This wasn't Randall, with his sweet words that turned to venom once the preacher had pronounced them man and wife. This man's eyes held no threat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He nodded once, then stood and moved toward a small stove in the corner. "Think you could manage some broth? You've been out for hours." "Hours," panic surged through her. "What time is it?" "Just past noon. Storm's let up some." He poured steaming liquid from a pot into a cup. "You got someone looking for you?" Fiona hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. This stranger had shown her kindness, but men could turn quickly when other men's property was involved. And that's what she was in the eyes of the law. Randall's property, no matter what he did to her. "No," she lied, accepting the cup with shaking hands. "No one's looking." The man's eyes lingered on her bruised face, his expression unreadable. "Name's Jake Young," he said finally. "This is my ranch." "Fiona," she replied, deliberately omitting her surname. "Fiona, just Fiona." Jake nodded, seeming to understand her caution. "Well, just Fiona. You're welcome to rest here until you're feeling stronger. Horse of yours needs rest too." "It's not," she began, then stopped herself. One crime on top of another would hardly endear her to this stranger. "Thank you." "There's a creek out back where you can wash up when you're ready," he continued. "And I've got some old shirts that might do for you until your things are proper dry." As he spoke, moving around the small space with the careful movements of a man used to being alone, Fiona studied him. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the scar that cut across one side. His hair, the color of wheat, was too long, as if he'd forgotten to have it cut. Everything about him suggested solitude, from the single chair at his table to the way he kept a measured distance from her, as if unused to sharing his space. "I won't impose long," Fiona promised, sipping the broth. It was simple but good, warming her from the inside out. "Once my horse is rested—" "Your horse needs more than rest," Jake interrupted. "That animal's half dead from exhaustion. Wherever you're heading, it won't be on that horse." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. Without the horse, she was truly stranded. She had planned to sell it in the next town, using the money to buy passage on a stagecoach heading west, somewhere Randall couldn't follow. "I don't," her voice broke. "I don't have anywhere to go." Jake watched her for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. "Then I reckon you can stay here until you figure it out." "Why would you help me? You don't know me." He turned away, moving to poke at the fire. "Let's just say I recognize trouble when I see it, and sometimes folks deserve a helping hand out of it." For the first time in years, Fiona felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, a fragile, cautious hope. Jake watched from the corral as Fiona hung laundry in the late afternoon sun. 2 days had passed since she'd arrived at his door, and though the bruises on her face had deepened to purple, her movements were growing steadier. She wore one of his shirts, the sleeves rolled up multiple times, and a pair of trousers he'd found in a trunk and cinched tight with rope. The clothes swallowed her whole. but she moved with a quiet dignity that tugged at something within him. She hadn't volunteered much about herself or what had brought her to his doorstep half dead in the rain, and Jake hadn't pressed. A man who valued his own privacy understood the worth of others. But he wasn't a fool. The bruises told their own story, one Jake had seen too often during his rare trips to town: women with downcast eyes, and marks they tried to hide, husbands who spoke for them and gripped their arms too tightly. Jake hammered another post into place, perhaps with more force than necessary. Whatever man had put his hands on Fiona deserved a reckoning, but that wasn't his place nor his business. "Is there anything I can help with?" Her voice startled him from his thoughts. She stood at the corral fence, shielding her eyes against the sun. "No need," he replied, setting down his hammer. "You should be resting." "I've rested enough," she said firmly, "and I won't be a burden. I can cook, clean, mend. I need to earn my keep." Jake wiped sweat from his brow with his shirt sleeve. "You're not a burden, Miss Fiona, and there's no debt to pay." A shadow crossed her face. "There's always a debt. Men don't offer help without expecting something in return." The bitterness in her voice struck him. "Not all men," he said quietly. Their eyes met across the corral, a moment of understanding passing between them. Whatever she saw in his expression must have reassured her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Even so," she continued, "I'd like to help. I'm not used to sitting idle." Jake considered her request. Truth was, having someone tend to the domestic tasks he'd neglected for years would be a welcome change. His cabin was clean enough but sparse, his meals simple and repetitive. "If you're feeling up to it," he conceded. "But don't push yourself, those ribs need time." Fiona nodded, a small smile lifting the corner of her mouth. It was the first he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face, hinting at the woman she might be without fear shadowing her eyes. "Thank you," she said. As she turned to walk back to the cabin, Jake found himself watching her go, something unfamiliar and uncomfortable stirring in his chest. 5 years he'd lived alone on this ranch, content with his solitude, or at least resigned to it. Now this woman had appeared from nowhere, bringing complications and possibly danger, and yet he couldn't bring himself to regret opening his door that night. Later, as dusk fell, Jake returned to the cabin to find it transformed. The floors had been swept, the sparse furniture polished, and something savory bubbled in a pot on the stove. Fiona stood at his small table, setting out the mismatched plates he rarely bothered with when eating alone. "Hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing around. "I found some supplies in your pantry." "I don't mind," he replied, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. The cabin smelled of cooking and soap lived in for the first time since he'd built it. "Didn't realize I had supplies worth using." Fiona's lips curved in another hint of a smile. "You had enough. I made stew." They ate together in companionable silence, the only sound the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional pop from the fire. Jake couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal with anyone in his home. Possibly never. "This is good," he said after a while. "Real good. Thank you." She kept her eyes on her bowl. "My mother taught me to cook, said a woman needs to know how to stretch ingredients when times are lean." It was the first personal detail she'd offered, and Jake treaded carefully. "Your mother sounds wise." She was. Fiona's voice softened with grief. "She died 3 years ago. Fever took her." "I'm sorry," Jake said, meaning it. He knew something about loss, about the hollow space left behind when someone who should have been there no longer was. "After she passed, I had few options," Fiona continued, still not meeting his eyes. "A woman alone. Well, the world isn't kind." "No," Jake agreed. "It often isn't." Randall seemed kind at first. Her voice had dropped so low Jake had to lean forward to hear her. "He was the son of the banker in our town. Respectable. Said all the right things." Her hand trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. "The first time he hit me was a month after we wed. Said I'd embarrassed him at church by speaking to another man too familiarly." Jake's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, understanding the importance of allowing her to speak her truth at her own pace. It got worse. Every time he'd apologize after. "Bring me flowers. Promise it would never happen again." Fiona finally looked up, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. Until the apologies stopped and the promises, and there was just the pain and the fear. He's looking for you, Jake said. It wasn't a question. Fiona nodded. By now, yes, he'll have realized I took money from his lockbox, and the horse I stole that too from our neighbor. She twisted her hands together in her lap. I'm a thief and a runaway wife. If the law finds me, they'll return me to him. It's his right. Not on my land, Jake said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. No man has the right to treat another human that way, law or no law. Fiona's eyes widened at his vehemence. You don't understand. Randall has connections, money. If he finds out I'm here, you'd be harboring a criminal. He could let me worry about that, Jake interrupted. He stood, gathering their empty bowls. You're safe here, Fiona, I give you my word. As he carried the dishes to the wash basin, Jake felt her eyes on him, measuring his sincerity against what must have been years of broken promises. He didn't blame her for her caution. Trust, once shattered, was not easily rebuilt. Why? She asked finally. Why would you risk yourself for a stranger? Jake paused, considering his answer carefully. Because there was a time when I needed help and didn't receive it, he said simply. And I swore I wouldn't be the kind of man who turns away from suffering if it was in my power to ease it. The cabin fell silent as his words hung in the air between them. After a moment, Fiona rose and joined him at the basin, taking a cloth to dry the dishes he washed. They worked side by side without speaking, but the silence had changed, becoming something almost companionable. As their hands occasionally brushed in the exchange of clean dishes, Jake felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him, not desire, though Fiona was certainly beautiful despite her bruises, but something rarer and more precious: connection. After years of deliberate solitude, he had forgotten its power. As days turned into a week, and then two, Fiona and Jake fell into an easy routine. Mornings found them sharing coffee at the small table before Jake headed out to tend to the cattle and mend fences. Fiona took charge of the domestic sphere, turning the sparse cabin into something that felt increasingly like a home. She discovered a long-abandoned vegetable garden behind the cabin and set about reclaiming it from the weeds, finding satisfaction in the simple work. The bruises on her face faded from purple to yellow, then disappeared entirely. With regular meals and rest, her body began to recover its natural curves, no longer gaunt from stress and fear. Sometimes, when she didn't think he was looking, Jake caught glimpses of the woman she must have been before Randall, laughing at the antics of a newborn calf, singing softly to herself as she worked in the garden, face turned up to catch the warmth of the sun. But he also noticed how she tensed at sudden sounds, how she positioned herself to always have a clear view of the door, how she sometimes woke crying out in the night. Jake had given her his bed, insisting on making a pallet for himself near the hearth. On the nights when her nightmares came, he kept his distance but spoke softly until her breathing steadied and she fell back into sleep. They never discussed these moments in the light of day, an unspoken agreement between them. Just as they never discussed the fact that, with each passing day, the likelihood of her leaving grew more remote. One evening, as summer settled fully over the land, they sat on the small porch Jake had built years ago but rarely used. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of the wildflowers Fiona had planted along the path to the door. I should leave, she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. I've imposed on your hospitality for too long. Jake felt a tightness in his chest at her words. You're not imposing, he replied, keeping his voice even. Your help around here has been valuable, even so. She twisted her hands in her lap, a nervous habit he'd come to recognize. The longer I stay, the greater the risk to you. Randall won't have given up searching. It's been nearly a month, Jake pointed out. If he was going to find you, wouldn't he have done so by now? Fiona shook her head. You don't know him, he's persistent, especially when his pride is wounded. She looked out at the darkening landscape. And I wounded it badly by leaving. Jake studied her profile in the fading light. In the weeks since she'd arrived, her hair had grown out a bit, the copper strands now brushing her shoulders. The fear that had shadowed her eyes had receded, though it never fully disappeared. He'd grown accustomed to her presence, to the sound of her humming as she worked, to the way she asked questions about the ranch with genuine interest, to the small touches she'd added to his Spartan home. The thought of returning to his solitude left a hollow feeling in his gut. "Where would you go?" he asked. Fiona sighed. "West, I suppose. California, maybe. Somewhere he wouldn't think to look." She turned to face him, her expression troubled. "But I have no money, no horse. I stole what little I had from Randall, and that's long gone. You could." Jake hesitated, unused to making such offers. "You could stay, permanently, as my housekeeper if you like." He rushed on before she could respond. "I'd pay you a fair wage. You'd have your own space I could build in addition to the cabin. It would be proper." Proper. Fiona repeated, a strange note in her voice. "There's nothing proper about an unmarried woman living with an unmarried man, Jake. You know that as well as I do." "Then we could." The words died in his throat as he realized what he'd been about to suggest: marriage. The thought had appeared in his mind with alarming clarity, as if it had been waiting there, unacknowledged, for weeks. Fiona's eyes widened as she registered what he'd almost said. "Jake, you can't forget I spoke," he cut in, standing abruptly. "It was a foolish suggestion." "No," she said softly, reaching out to catch his hand as he turned to go. "Not foolish, just unexpected." Jake looked down at her slender fingers wrapped around his calloused ones. When was the last time someone had reached for him this way, with gentleness rather than violence? He couldn't remember. "I'm not asking for anything from you," he said, his voice rough. "You've had enough of men making demands. I don't want you to leave because you think you have to. This place, it's big enough for two people living separate lives if that's what you want." Fiona stood, still holding his hand. In the gathering twilight, her face was difficult to read. "And if that's not what I want?" The question hung between them, laden with possibilities neither had dared voice. Jake felt his pulse quicken, hope and fear warring within him. "Then tell me what you do want," he said finally. Instead of answering with words, Fiona stepped closer, tilted her face up to his, and pressed her lips gently to his cheek. The kiss was fleeting, chaste, but it sent a current through Jake that left him momentarily speechless. "Time," she whispered, drawing back. "I need time, Jake, to be certain of my own mind, to know that what I'm feeling isn't just gratitude or fear." Jake nodded, understanding. After what she'd endured, rushing into another relationship, even one as different from her marriage as this would be, might only lead to regret. "Time is something we have plenty of out here," he said, managing a small smile. "And you're welcome to as much of it as you need." Fiona's answering smile was like the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, tentative but full of promise. "Thank you," she said simply. As they stood together on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the sky, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever came next, whatever Fiona ultimately decided, he knew with certainty that opening his door to her that stormy night had changed the course of his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The seasons turned, summer heat giving way to the cooler days of early autumn. Fiona's garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables that transformed Jake's formerly plain meals into something worth savoring. They settled into an easy partnership, each contributing to the daily workings of the ranch in their own way. Jake taught Fiona to ride one of his gentler mares, and they began taking occasional trips into the small town of Cedar Creek, 15 miles to the east. The first such journey had filled Fiona with trepidation. What if someone recognized her? What if word somehow got back to Randall? But the tiny settlement was remote enough that news traveled slowly, if at all, and the townspeople accepted Jake's introduction of her as a cousin who had come to help after the death of her husband. "It's not a complete lie," Jake had reasoned as they'd ridden home after that first visit. "Your husband is dead to you and you are helping." Fiona had smiled at his attempt to ease her conscience. "And the cousin part, well," he'd admitted with a sheepish grin, "that part's a lie, but a necessary one." Now, as October painted the landscape in golds and reds, they rode into town for the annual harvest festival. Fiona wore a new dress she'd made from fabric purchased on their last visit, her hair pinned up neatly beneath a modest bonnet. Jake, unusually, had trimmed his hair and beard and wore a clean shirt she'd pressed for him. "You look nice," she commented as they approached the town, the sound of fiddle music already drifting to meet them. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Feel like a dressed-up monkey," he grumbled, but the corners of his mouth twitched upward. A very handsome monkey, Fiona teased, earning a rare full smile from him. The town square had been transformed with paper lanterns, trestle tables laden with food, and a wooden platform where musicians played lively tunes. Children ran laughing between the adults, and the scent of roasting meat and baked goods filled the air. Jake helped Fiona down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. Over the months, their physical awareness of each other had grown, expressed in small touches and glances rather than words. They had yet to cross the line into anything more intimate than the occasional brush of lips against a cheek or forehead, but the possibility of more hovered between them, unspoken but acknowledged. "Mrs. Patterson," a voice called, and they turned to see the shopkeeper's wife approaching, gray curls bouncing beneath her hat. "And Mr. Young, how lovely to see you both." "Mrs. Patterson," Fiona greeted warmly. She had grown fond of the older woman during their visits to town. "The decorations look beautiful." "Oh, thank you, dear. We do try to make it special each year." The woman's kind eyes moved between Fiona and Jake. "Will you be staying for the dancing? It's not often we get to see this grumpy bear of a man participate in social activities." Jake cleared his throat. "I don't dance, Mrs. Patterson. 2 left feet." "Nonsense," the older woman scoffed. "Every man can dance if properly motivated." She gave Fiona a conspiratorial wink. "And I'd say you have proper motivation this year, wouldn't you, Mr. Young?" Before Jake could respond, Mrs. Patterson was called away by another townsperson, leaving them in a moment of awkward silence. "We don't have to dance," Fiona said quickly, noticing Jake's discomfort. "I'm happy just to watch." Jake studied her face, seeing the longing she tried to hide. "Would you like to?" he asked. "Dance, I mean." Fiona hesitated, then nodded. "I used to love dancing before, well before, but truly, Jake, don't feel obligated." "Not obligated," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Honored." They spent the afternoon enjoying the festivities, sampling the various dishes brought by the townspeople, and conversing with neighbors they rarely saw. Fiona noticed how the other women watched Jake, his tall, broad-shouldered figure cutting an impressive silhouette, despite his reluctance to be the center of attention. The scar that marked his face seemed only to add to his mystique, and she felt an unexpected flicker of possessiveness. As twilight descended, and the lanterns were lit, the tempo of the music changed to a waltz. Jake, who had been deep in conversation with the blacksmith about a piece of equipment he needed repaired, turned to find Fiona watching the couples taking to the makeshift dance floor. Without a word, he extended his hand to her. Fiona looked up in surprise, then placed her fingers in his palm, allowing him to lead her toward the music. "I thought you had 2 left feet," she murmured as he drew her into the proper position, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. "I might have exaggerated," he admitted, beginning to move in time with the music. "Didn't want Mrs. Patterson getting any ideas." "And what ideas would those be?" Fiona asked, following his lead with natural grace. Jake's blue eyes held hers as they turned slowly among the other dancers. "That I have any right to dance with the prettiest woman at the festival." The compliment, delivered in his straightforward manner, brought warmth to Fiona's cheeks. "You're full of surprises tonight, Mr. Young. Is that good or bad?" "Good," she assured him, allowing herself to step slightly closer. "Definitely good." As they danced beneath the stars and paper lanterns, something shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained, the unspoken boundaries, began to dissolve. Fiona felt it in the way Jake held her, firmly but with reverence, as if she were something precious. She saw it in his eyes, the usual guardedness giving way to an emotion that made her heart beat faster. Later, as they rode home under a canopy of stars, a comfortable silence enveloped them. The ranch came into view, the cabin a dark silhouette against the moonlit landscape. It struck Fiona how much this place had come to feel like home in the months since she'd arrived, not just the physical structure, but the sense of safety, of belonging, she'd found within its walls and with the man beside her. "I had a wonderful time," she said as Jake helped her down from her horse. "So did I," he replied, his hands lingering at her waist. They stood close, the night air cool around them, their breath forming small clouds in the space between. Fiona looked up at him, at the face that had become so dear to her. The scar that had once seemed intimidating now felt like simply another part of him, a mark of a life lived with courage. Without overthinking, she reached up and traced its path with gentle fingers. Jake stood perfectly still, letting her touch him, his eyes never leaving hers. When her fingers reached his jaw, he turned his head slightly to press a kiss against her palm. "Fiona," he said, her name a question and a promise all at once. In answer, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, exploratory, but deepened as Jake's arms encircled her, drawing her against his chest. Fiona felt herself melting into him, all the tension and uncertainty of the past months dissolving in the warmth of his embrace. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing unevenly. Jake rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he admitted softly. "Why didn't you?" Fiona asked, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. Jake opened his eyes, their blue depths serious in the moonlight. "Because you needed to be the one to decide, to choose. After what you've been through." Understanding washed through her. Jake had been giving her space to heal, to find herself again, to make her own choices without pressure or expectation. It was perhaps the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for waiting. For understanding." He brushed a strand of hair from her face with calloused fingers. "I would have waited forever if that's what you needed." The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. This was what love should be, Fiona realized, patient, kind, respectful. Not the controlling possession Randall had called love, but this gentle strength that allowed her to be fully herself. "I don't need forever," she told him, reaching up to kiss him again. "Just you, just this." Jake smiled against her lips, then swept her into his arms, carrying her toward the cabin and the future they would build together. The winter of 1875 brought heavy snows to the territory, isolating the ranch for weeks at a time. Jake and Fiona weathered it together, finding joy in the simple rhythms of their days. They rose with the dawn, worked side by side caring for the animals and maintaining the homestead, and spent evenings by the fire, talking or reading from the small collection of books Jake had accumulated over the years. In town, they were now acknowledged as a couple, though the precise nature of their relationship remained undefined to outsiders. Mrs. Patterson and the other women of Cedar Creek had taken to including Fiona in their quilting circles and social gatherings, treating her with a warmth that helped heal wounds deeper than the physical ones she'd carried to Jake's door. As for Jake, the townsfolk noted the changes in the formerly taciturn rancher with knowing smiles. He spoke more, smiled more, and even laughed occasionally, a sound that had been rare enough before to cause heads to turn the first time it rang out across the general store. One snowy evening in January, as they sat before the fire, Jake unexpectedly rose and went to his trunk in the corner. Fiona watched curiously as he rummaged through its contents, finally extracting a small wooden box. "Been meaning to give you this," he said, returning to sit beside her. He placed the box in her hands, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Fiona opened it to find a simple gold band nestled inside. "Jake," she breathed, looking up at him with wide eyes. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Only thing of hers I kept after she passed." He took a deep breath. "I want you to have it, Fiona, not just the ring, but my name, my life, everything I am or ever will be." Tears blurred her vision as she looked at the man before her, strong yet gentle, steadfast yet capable of such tenderness. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jake Young?" "Been trying to work up the courage for weeks," he admitted with a rueful smile. "Words don't come easy to me, but yes, I'm asking you to be my wife, if you'll have me." Fiona closed her hand around the ring, feeling its weight not as a shackle but as an anchor, a connection to the life they would build together. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jake's face transformed with joy as he gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotions words couldn't capture. When they drew apart, he took the ring from her hand and slid it onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made for her. "It's beautiful," she whispered, admiring how the gold caught the firelight. "Like its new owner, Jake replied, earning a soft laugh from Fiona. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Cedar Creek, with Mrs. Patterson and her husband serving as witnesses. The preacher, a kind-faced man with silver hair, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, his words emphasizing partnership and mutual respect rather than submission and obedience. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Fiona felt none of the trepidation that had marked her first marriage, only a deep sense of rightness, of coming home. Jake's kiss was gentle yet possessive, a promise of the life they would share. That night, in the privacy of the cabin that was now truly theirs together, they came together as husband and wife. Jake's hands, so capable in all they did, proved equally skilled in bringing Fiona pleasure, his patience allowing her to overcome the fear and pain associated with physical intimacy in her past. In his arms, she discovered what it meant to be truly cherished, to be loved with both body and soul. Afterward, lying in the quiet darkness with Jake's heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, Fiona felt a peace she had thought forever beyond her reach. "I love you," she whispered, the words new on her lips. Jake's arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Fiona Young." More than I ever thought possible. Spring came early that year, bringing with it new life across the ranch. Calves wobbled on spindly legs beside their mothers, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and Fiona's garden burst into growth under her careful tending. With the improved weather came increased trips to town, where Jake arranged to have lumber delivered for the addition to the cabin he'd promised months earlier. Though they shared the main room and bed now as husband and wife, he was determined to provide Fiona with a proper home, one with space for the family they hoped to create together. It was during one such trip to town in late April that the past Fiona had been running from finally caught up to them. They had just finished loading supplies into their wagon when a commotion at the other end of the street caught their attention. A man was dismounting from a lathered horse, his voice carrying as he questioned a group of townspeople. Fiona froze, her blood turning to ice as she recognized the figure, tall, well-dressed, with the arrogant bearing that had once seemed so impressive to her naive younger self. "Randall," she whispered, her hand clutching Jake's arm. Jake followed her gaze, his body tensing as he understood. Without a word, he positioned himself between Fiona and the newcomer, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "Get in the wagon," he said quietly. "If anything happens, take the reins and go. Don't look back." "I won't leave you," Fiona protested, fear and determination warring in her voice. "Fiona." His eyes met hers, intense and unwavering. "Trust me." Before she could respond, Randall Taylor's voice cut through the air. "You there? I'm looking for a woman. Auburn hair, green eyes." "Name's Fiona Taylor, my wife." Jake turned slowly to face the man, his expression carefully neutral. "No one by that name around here, mister," Randall approached, his cold gaze taking in Jake's worn clothes and the simple wagon behind him. "I've been tracking her for months. Trail led me here." His eyes narrowed as he spotted Fiona half hidden behind Jake's broad shoulders. "There she is." Jake didn't move, his stance relaxed but ready. "You're mistaken. This is my wife, Fiona Young." "Like hell she is," Randall snarled, his handsome face contorting with rage. "That's my property you're claiming, cowboy. She ran from me, stole from me." He took another step forward. "Fiona, get over here. Now." Fiona stepped out from behind Jake, her chin lifted despite the fear coursing through her. "I'm not your property, Randall. I never was." "The law says different," Randall countered, his voice dangerously soft. "A wife belongs to her husband, and you, my dear, are still legally my wife." He glanced at Jake with contempt. "Whatever charade you've been playing out here with this rancher." "Our marriage is legal and binding," Jake said evenly. "Performed by Preacher Collins right here in Cedar Creek." "Bigamy is a crime," Randall replied, a cruel smile twisting his lips, "and theft and horse stealing. Shall I continue? The law's on my side, friend." By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, Fiona spotted Mrs. Patterson and the blacksmith, their faces concerned. "The law might be," Jake acknowledged, "but the people here aren't." He gestured to the townsfolk around them. "These good folks know Fiona as my wife. They've welcomed her, protected her. You really think they'll just stand by and let you drag her away?" Uncertainty flickered across Randall's face as he took in the gathering crowd, many of whom were regarding him with open hostility. Furthermore, Jake continued, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence, a man who beats his wife until she's half dead might find that the law suddenly has bigger concerns than a runaway spouse, especially when there are witnesses to those beatings. Witnesses, Randall scoffed. There are no witnesses. It would be your word against mine, and I'm a respected businessman. Perhaps in your town, came a new voice, and the crowd parted to reveal Sheriff Morgan, a grizzled man with shrewd eyes. But here in Cedar Creek, we tend to believe our own. He stepped forward, thumbs hooked in his belt. Mr. and Mrs. Young are valued members of this community. I'd think carefully before making any accusations, Mr. Taylor, Randall supplied, his confidence visibly wavering. Randall Taylor of Green River. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. Green River, that's a fair piece from here, and you say this woman is your wife. She is, Randall insisted. Married 3 years ago by Reverend James in Green River. I have the documentation. Interesting, the sheriff mused. Because I have documentation right here in town that says she's Mrs. Young, married this past winter. He fixed Randall with a hard stare. Now, I'm no legal expert, but it seems to me we have ourselves a situation that would require a judge to sort out. Nearest circuit judge won't be through these parts for another 2 months. Fiona's heart pounded as she realized what the sheriff was doing, buying time, creating doubt, protecting one of his own. 2 months. Randall's face flushed with anger. I'm not waiting 2 months. I've spent nearly a year tracking down my runaway wife. Well, that's unfortunate, Sheriff Morgan replied calmly, but that's how the law works in this territory, slowly. He adjusted his hat. In the meantime, the lady stays right where she is with her current husband. Randall's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, but before he could draw, Jake had his own weapon leveled at the man's chest. I wouldn't, Jake said quietly. Not with half the town watching and the sheriff right here. Wouldn't look good for a respected businessman like yourself to be gunned down while trying to shoot an officer of the law. A tense silence fell as the two men stared at each other, Randall's hand hovering near his weapon, Jake steadily aiming at his heart. This isn't over, Randall finally spat, slowly moving his hand away from his gun. I'll be back with papers with the law on my side. You do that, Sheriff Morgan said, seemingly unperturbed. In the meantime, I'd suggest you find accommodations elsewhere. Cedar Creek isn't fond of men who threaten its citizens. With a final venomous glare at Fiona, Randall turned and stalked back to his horse. The crowd parted to let him pass, many faces openly hostile. As he mounted and rode away, the tension in the air gradually dissipated. Jake holstered his weapon and turned to Fiona, concern etched on his features. Are you all right? She nodded, though her hands trembled. Yes, thank you, she looked to the sheriff. And thank you, Sheriff Morgan, I don't know how to repay your kindness. The older man shrugged. No kindness about it, just doing my job, protecting the people of this town. He glanced in the direction Randall had disappeared, but he's right about one thing, he'll be back, and next time he might bring more than just threats. Jake's arm circled Fiona's shoulders protectively. We'll be ready. As they drove the wagon back to the ranch, a heavy silence hung between them. The confrontation with Randall had shattered the peace they'd carefully built, casting a shadow over their future. I'm sorry, Fiona said finally, her voice small. I've brought this trouble to your door, just as I feared I would. Jake's hands were steady on the reins, his profile resolute against the afternoon sun. You have nothing to apologize for, Fiona, nothing. But Randall was right legally, I'm still his wife, our marriage. Her voice caught on the word, is real, Jake finished firmly, maybe not in the eyes of some distant law, but in every way that matters. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes intense. I meant what I said when I made my vows to you, for better or worse, Fiona. This is just the worst part we have to get through. Tears stung her eyes at his unwavering loyalty. What are we going to do? Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering. We have options, he said finally. We could leave, start fresh somewhere even farther west. California, like you first planned. Leave the ranch, Fiona asked, knowing how much the land meant to Jake. Your home, it's just land, he replied, though she could hear the cost of those words. You're my home now. The simplicity of his declaration nearly undid her. "I won't ask that of you, Jake, not yet. Sheriff Morgan bought us time. Maybe there's another way." Jake nodded, reaching over to take her hand in his. "Then we'll find it, together." That night, as they lay together in their bed, Fiona's thoughts kept returning to the confrontation in town, to the hatred in Randall's eyes, to the threat he still posed to the happiness she'd found. "Jake," she whispered into the darkness. "Are you awake?" came his drowsy response. "What is it, love?" "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you months ago." She took a deep breath. "About Randall, about why I finally left." Jake shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her, his expression serious in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "I'm listening." Fiona steeled herself, the memories she tried so hard to bury rising to the surface. "The last time, the night before I ran. It was worse than ever before." Her voice trembled. "He'd been drinking, accused me of all sorts of imagined betrayals. When I denied them, She swallowed hard. "He beat me until I couldn't stand then, forced himself on me." Jake's body went rigid beside her, a muscle working in his jaw. "Fiona, let me finish," she pleaded. "I need to say this." When he nodded, she continued. "Afterward, when he was sleeping, I knew it would only get worse. That one day he might kill me, so I took his money, stole Mr. Wilson's horse, and ran." Her eyes sought Jake's in the darkness. "But that's not all. The reason I've been so afraid of him finding me. Jake, when I left, I was carrying his child." Jake's breath caught audibly. "You were pregnant." Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes. "Yes, but the journey, the fear, the injuries. I lost the baby during that storm, the night I found your ranch. I think that's why I collapsed at your door. It was more than exhaustion and the beating." Jake gathered her gently into his arms, cradling her against his chest as silent sobs shook her body. He said nothing, simply held her, his strength a comfort as she finally released the grief and guilt she'd carried alone for so many months. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered when she could speak again. "I was afraid you'd think less of me somehow." "Never," Jake vowed, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing could make me think less of you, Fiona, nothing." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for trusting me with this." "There's one more thing," she said, drawing away slightly to look into his eyes. "Something I've only just realized myself." She took his hand and placed it gently over her abdomen. "I think I'm pregnant again, Jake, with your child." In the moonlight, she watched joy transform his face, erasing the lines of worry that had formed during the day's confrontation. "A baby." "You're sure?" "Not entirely," she admitted. "But I'm late and I've been feeling different, the same signs I recognized before, only this time." She smiled through her tears. "This time there's happiness mixed with the fear." Jake kissed her then, pouring all his love and protection into the gesture. "No one will harm you or our child," he promised against her lips. "I swear it on my life, Fiona. Whatever I have to do, whatever it takes, you'll both be safe." As she drifted towards sleep in the circle of his arms, Fiona believed him. The shadow of Randall still loomed, but it seemed less substantial now, less able to touch the future they were building together. The next morning, Jake rode out at dawn, leaving Fiona still sleeping peacefully. He left a note promising to return by noon and asking her to stay close to the cabin. With Randall Taylor in the area, he wasn't taking any chances with her safety. His destination was the small, neat home at the edge of Cedar Creek, where Sheriff Morgan lived with his wife of 30 years. The older man was already on his porch, smoking a pipe and watching the sunrise when Jake arrived. "Expected you might pay me a visit," the sheriff greeted, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Coffee's hot inside if you want some." "I'm fine, thank you," Jake replied, taking the offered seat. "I appreciate what you did yesterday, Sheriff." Morgan nodded, tapping his pipe against the porch railing. "Wasn't just for you, young man like that, coming into my town throwing his weight around don't sit right with me." "Even so." Jake leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "But you and I both know he'll be back, and with the law on his side next time." "Likely," the sheriff agreed. Man seemed the determined sort. "I need to know what my options are," Jake said directly. "Legally speaking." Sheriff Morgan studied him for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Legally speaking, you don't have many. If what he says is true and he has documentation of their marriage, then your marriage to Fiona isn't valid in the eyes of the law. She'd still be his wife. Jake had expected this answer, but hearing it stated so plainly sent a cold knot of fear through his stomach. And the fact that he abused her, that he drove her to flee for her life, the older man sighed heavily. Courts don't like to interfere in what they consider private matters between husband and wife. It's changing slowly in some places, but out here, he shook his head. I wouldn't count on it making much difference. So what would you suggest? Jake asked, struggling to keep his voice level. Because I'll tell you now, Sheriff, I won't let him take her back, not while I'm breathing. Figured as much, Morgan replied, a hint of approval in his tone. Well, you could run. Pack up and head west like many before you. California's a big place, easy to lose yourself in. Jake nodded. It was the option he'd already considered, though the thought of abandoning the ranch he'd built from nothing pained him deeply. The sheriff hesitated, then continued, There's another way, though I can't officially recommend it. He looked Jake directly in the eye. Sometimes, problems like Mr. Taylor have a way of solving themselves in territories like ours. Dangerous country. Accidents happen. Jake held the older man's gaze, understanding the unspoken suggestion. I'm not a murderer, Sheriff. Didn't say you were, Morgan replied calmly. Just stating facts about frontier life. He paused. Though I should mention, self-defense isn't murder. Man threatens you or your family on your own property, well, jury round here would likely see that different than cold-blooded killing. The implication was clear, and Jake felt a cold resolve forming within him. He had never sought violence, had tried to leave those instincts behind with the war, but for Fiona and their unborn child, he would do whatever necessary. One more thing, the sheriff added, his voice dropping lower. Got a telegram yesterday from the marshal over in Green River. Seems Mr. Taylor isn't as respected there as he'd have us believe. There've been incidents, questions about the death of his first wife, nothing proven, but enough suspicion that some folks there wouldn't mind seeing the back of him. This new information sent a fresh wave of determination through Jake. Randall Taylor wasn't just a threat to Fiona, he was a monster who had likely done this before, who would do it again if not stopped. Thank you, Sheriff, Jake said, rising to his feet, for everything. Morgan nodded, his eyes knowing. Just be careful, young. Whatever comes, be smart about it. As Jake rode back to the ranch, his mind worked through contingencies, plans, preparations. If Randall returned with the law behind him, they would be ready to flee. But if he came alone, seeking to take Fiona by force, Jake's hand tightened on the reins at the thought. He arrived home to find Fiona hanging laundry in the yard, her copper hair gleaming in the late morning sun. She smiled when she saw him, and the simple sight of her safe here has strengthened his resolve. Everything all right? She asked as he dismounted. Jake crossed to her, taking her face gently between his hands and kissing her with a fervor that left her breathless. It will be, he promised. One way or another. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. Jake reinforced the doors and windows of the cabin, cleaned and checked his weapons, and made arrangements with a neighbor to look after the cattle if they had to leave suddenly. He also rode into town twice more, conferring with Sheriff Morgan and purchasing supplies they might need for a journey west. Fiona, meanwhile, put up preserves from her garden, sewed new clothes for them both, and packed what few personal possessions they would take if forced to flee. They spoke little of the threat hanging over them, focusing instead on the future they were determined to have together and the child growing within her. A week passed with no sign of Randall Taylor. Then another. As May bloomed across the land, they began to hope that perhaps he had given up, returned to Green River, decided Fiona wasn't worth the trouble. It was a hope that died one clear morning as Jake was mending a fence on the far side of the property. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention, and he straightened, squinting against the sun to see 3 riders approaching Randall Taylor at their head, flanked by 2 men Jake didn't recognize. Jake set down his tools and moved to where his horse was tethered nearby, ensuring his rifle was secure in its scabbard. Taylor, he greeted coldly as the men drew to a halt several yards away. Randall's smile was all predatory satisfaction. Young, I told you I'd be back. He gestured to the men beside him. "This is Deputy Marshal Harris from Green River, and this is Judge Wells. I've brought the law with me this time, as promised." Jake studied the two men. The deputy was young, barely more than a boy, with an uncomfortable expression that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his role in this confrontation. The judge was older, jowly, with the florid complexion of a heavy drinker. "Gentlemen," Jake acknowledged with a slight nod. "What can I do for you?" The deputy cleared his throat. "Mr. Young, we have documentation confirming that Fiona Taylor is legally married to Mr. Randall Taylor here. We've come to escort her back to her lawful husband." "My wife's name is Fiona Young," Jake replied evenly. "And she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." The judge spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Mr. Young, I understand your attachment to the woman, but the law is clear. A marriage cannot be valid if one of the parties is already married to someone else. Mrs. Taylor's marriage to you is null and void. And the fact that he beat her nearly to death," Jake challenged, his anger rising, "that she fled for her life, does the law have nothing to say about that?" The judge and deputy exchanged uncomfortable glances, but it was Randall who answered, his voice smooth. "Ridiculous accusations. My wife has always had a vivid imagination. She injured herself falling from a horse shortly before she disappeared. I have witnesses." "Convenient," Jake commented, his hand resting near his pistol. "And what about your first wife, Taylor, the one who died so mysteriously? Did she fall from a horse too?" A flash of something dangerous crossed Randall's face. "You're treading on thin ice, Cowboy, Mr. Young," the deputy interjected, clearly trying to diffuse the growing tension. "We're not here to adjudicate domestic disputes. We're simply enforcing the law as it stands. Mrs. Taylor must return with her legal husband." Jake's eyes never left Randall's. "She's not here." "What?" Randall's composure cracked. "Where is she?" "Safe," Jake replied simply. "Beyond your reach." It was a lie, but a necessary one. Fiona was at the cabin, hopefully unaware of the confrontation occurring at the edge of their property. If he could convince these men she was gone, perhaps they would leave without approaching the house. "You're lying," Randall snarled. "She's here somewhere, and I will find her." He turned to the deputy. "Search the property. She can't have gone far." The young man hesitated. "Mr. Taylor, we don't have a warrant to search." "Then get one," Randall exploded, his carefully maintained facade crumbling. "She's my wife, my property." "There it is," Jake said softly. "The real Randall Taylor, not so respectable now, is he, gentlemen?" The judge shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Perhaps we should return to town, discuss this matter further." "No." Randall's face had flushed an ugly red. "I've waited long enough. I'm taking what's mine today." His hand moved to his gun. "Get out of my way, Young, or I'll go through you." Time seemed to slow as Jake assessed the situation. The deputy was young, inexperienced, unlikely to draw quickly. The judge was no threat at all, but Randall, the hatred in his eyes, promised violence, regardless of witnesses. "I won't tell you again," Jake said, his voice deadly calm. "Leave my property. Leave my wife alone." "She is not your wife," Randall roared, and in one fluid motion drew his pistol. Jake was faster. His hand moved with the speed born of necessity, his weapon clearing leather and firing before Randall could aim. The shot cracked across the open land, and Randall's expression shifted from rage to surprise as red bloomed across his chest. He toppled from his horse, hitting the ground with a dull thud as the deputy and judge looked on in horror. "Self-defense," Jake said firmly, his gun still raised. "You both saw it. He drew first." The deputy had gone pale, his hand frozen halfway to his own weapon. Yes, he did draw first." The judge seemed to have aged years in seconds, his florid face now ashen. "A regrettable incident," he muttered. "Most regrettable." Jake kept his gun trained on them as he stepped forward to check Randall. The man's eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the clear blue sky above. Jake felt for a pulse, found none, and straightened. "He's dead," he announced, feeling no remorse, only a grim satisfaction that the threat to Fiona was finally, permanently eliminated. "What happens now?" the deputy asked, looking to the judge for guidance. The older man sighed heavily. Now, young man, we return to town and report that Randall Taylor was killed while attempting to use deadly force against Mr. Young here. A clear case of self-defense, as he stated. He fixed Jake with a meaningful look. I imagine Sheriff Morgan will want to investigate, but given the circumstances and witnesses, I see no reason for charges to be brought. Jake holstered his weapon slowly. And my wife, the judge paused, then inclined his head slightly. With Mr. Taylor's unfortunate passing, the complications regarding Mrs. Young's marital status have been resolved. The law no longer has any interest in the matter. Relief washed through Jake, though he kept his expression neutral. I'd appreciate if you'd inform Sheriff Morgan of what happened here. I need to return to my wife. Of course, the deputy agreed quickly, seemingly eager to be away from the scene. We'll send someone for the body. As the two men rode away, leading Randall's horse with his body draped across it, Jake stood for a long moment, letting the reality of what had occurred settle over him. He had taken a life, something he'd sworn never to do again after the war, but he could not find it in himself to regret it. Not when Fiona's safety, their future together, had hung in the balance. With a deep breath, he mounted his horse and turned toward home, toward Fiona, toward the peace they had fought so hard to secure. He found her waiting on the porch, her face pale with worry. I heard a shot, she said as he dismounted. What happened? Jake took her hands in his, looking directly into her eyes. Randall's dead, he said simply. He came with a deputy and a judge to take you back. Drew on me, I was faster. Fiona's eyes widened, her hands tightening on his. You killed him. Yes. Jake waited, prepared for her shock, her horror, perhaps even her fear of him. Instead, she stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. It's over then, she whispered. Truly over. Jake held her close, feeling the slight swell of her belly against him, their child, their future, now secure. Yes, he confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. It's over. He can never hurt you again. They stood together on the porch of the home they had made, the shadow that had hung over them for so long finally lifted. The path ahead was clear now, unmarred by fear or uncertainty. What happens now? Fiona asked, looking up at him with eyes that held no judgment, only love and relief. Jake smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and erased the tension of the past weeks. Now, he said, we live. Autumn 1876 brought golden light to the expanded cabin on the Young ranch. Jake had completed the addition. He'd promised Fiona 2 new rooms extending from the original structure, with large windows to catch the morning sun. The homestead had flourished under their joint care, the cattle herd growing, the garden expanded, the future secure. On a crisp October morning, Fiona stood at one of those windows, gently rocking the small bundle in her arms. Elizabeth Morgan Young, named for Jake's mother and the sheriff who had stood by them in their time of need, was 3 months old, with her father's blue eyes and a dusting of copper hair that promised to match her mother's. "SHH, little one," Fiona murmured, smiling down at her daughter's scrunched face. "Your papa will be back soon." As if summoned by her words, she heard hoofbeats approaching, and moments later, Jake appeared, returning from his morning rounds of the property. Even now, with the threat of Randall long behind them, he maintained a vigilant watch over their land, their safety, their peace. The investigation into Randall's death had been brief, perfunctory. Sheriff Morgan, the judge, and the young deputy had all confirmed Jake's account of self-defense. In the months that followed, other stories had emerged from Green River whispers about Randall's first wife, about other women he had harmed, about business dealings that wouldn't bear scrutiny. The man's death, it seemed, had freed more than just Fiona. Jake entered the cabin, bringing with him the scent of autumn air and horses. His face, once so guarded, now relaxed into an easy smile at the sight of his wife and daughter. "How are my girls this morning?" he asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door and crossing to them. "Hungry," Fiona replied with a laugh. "Both of us. Elizabeth is demanding her breakfast, and I was hoping her father might be persuaded to cook some eggs." Jake brushed a kiss across her forehead, then gently touched his daughter's cheek with one finger. The baby turned toward the touch, her tiny mouth opening in a yawn. Eggs I can manage, he agreed, moving toward the stove. Got news from town yesterday. The railroad's definitely coming through next year, means better prices for our cattle, easier travel. Fiona nodded, settling into the rocking chair to feed Elizabeth. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it in her last letter. She says half the town is celebrating, the other half worried about what changes it will bring. Change isn't always bad, Jake commented, cracking eggs into a pan. Brought you to my door, didn't it? Fiona smiled at the memory, so different now from the terror it had once evoked. That it did. They moved through their morning routine with the easy harmony of a couple who had weathered storms together and emerged stronger. Breakfast, chores. Planning for the coming winter, ordinary moments made extraordinary by the simple fact that they were shared. Later, as afternoon sunshine bathed the land in gold, they walked together to the small rise behind the cabin. Elizabeth slept peacefully in her mother's arms, wrapped snugly against the autumn chill. The view from the hilltop encompassed the entire ranch, the grazing cattle, the neat cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, the distant mountains framing it all. Do you ever regret it? Fiona asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Taking me in that night, everything that came after. Jake looked at her, his expression serious. Not for a moment, he said firmly, not one single moment, even though you had to. She hesitated, still reluctant to speak directly of Randall's death, though she had long since made peace with it. Even then, Jake confirmed. To protect you, to protect our family, I'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat. Fiona shifted Elizabeth to one arm so she could take Jake's hand with her free one. I used to dream of escape, she confessed. During those dark years with Randall, I'd close my eyes and imagine being somewhere safe, somewhere I could breathe without fear. She looked up at him, her green eyes bright with emotion. But even in my most hopeful moments, I never imagined this. You, Elizabeth, this life we've built. Jake squeezed her hand gently. When you showed up at my door that night, I was a man half alive, he told her. Existing, not living. You changed that, Fiona. You brought me back to life. He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes reflecting the depth of his feeling. I promised you peace, and I mean to keep that promise for all our days. You already have, Fiona assured him, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. Every day with you is peaceful, even when it's hard, because I know I'm loved. I know I'm safe. As they stood together on the hilltop, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, the setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and rose. Behind them lay the past, its pain, its struggles, its darkness. Before them stretched the future, bright with promise and possibility. Fiona had fled a house of violence, and Jake had opened his door, offering peace. But what they had found together was far more than mere absence of conflict. It was joy, partnership, family, love. A life built on mutual respect and unwavering commitment. A love forged in adversity and strengthened by shared dreams. As twilight descended over the ranch, they walked hand in hand back to their home, their sanctuary, the place where they had both, at last, found peace.